Hi everyone, this is part 1 of chapter 7. So chapter 7 is a 2-week chapter. So this week we'll just cover approximately half of the chapter. We're going to start at the beginning of the chapter and cover pages 179 through 185. And then I'm going to skip a few pages and we're going to cover pages 192 and 193. These pages overall are the most chemistry related parts of the chapter as far as water. And so we'll do kind of the chemistry portion this week and then more of the application. It's still some chemistry, but more of the applied part of it next week when we do part 2. Okay, so water is a nutrient, and a nutrient is any food component that is necessary to sustain life. So these nutrients include water, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, vitamins, and minerals. We're going to be covering all of these in this order after we get done with this chapter and delve into some of them more than others. But water is our first nutrient in our list of them that we'll be going through. Water is known as the universal solvent, and it's called that because it can dissolve so many substances. Generally, if we refer to a solution of whatever, unless you state otherwise, it's assumed that water is what is the solvent. Um, if it is something different, you usually say an ethanol solution or something like that. And so it's in just about everything, right? It's in all of these foods that we eat. The amount of it changes the texture of our food. So this is a showing steak that is more or less well done. But in addition to the proteins being, cooked more, there is a difference in moisture, right? The well done steak has a lot less moisture in it, and that contributes to the texture of that steak. Okay. Um, Water is absolutely vital for sanitation, for cleaning things and keeping our food supply safe. Um, it's even more essential just for running our bodies. So water regulates our body temperature. It's part of the circulatory system, and that running through our body regulates temperature. Um, it is it's a carrier of waste. Um, it even our bones that we think of as more solid, still 22% of the bones. It's used to cushion our joints. If you have loss of water in the discs and things that are between joints, it's extremely painful. Um, as part of the blood, it helps carry nutrients and oxygen to your cells. Um, it moistens oxygen for breathing, which is kind of, something that you don't really think about as necessary, but it is. Um, it's required to convert food to energy, and the reaction that produces ATP, water is a part of it. Um, it protects and cushions vital organs, helps our body absorb nutrients. So as a solvent, the nutrients will be dissolved in the water and then go pass through the small intestine into the bloodstream. And it makes up 75% of your muscles. Uh, we absolutely need it for cooking, whether it is boiling things or steaming them. We use water to cook. We've As we've previously talked about, when we microwave, the biggest component of the food that is affected by those microwaves is the water, and that heats up the food faster. So if you have a high water food, it's going to heat up faster in the microwave than something that is has less moisture. Um, Water, it controls how bacteria grow, how microorganisms grow. So microorganisms generally prefer a high water environment, and if they don't have that, then they will be suppressed, and that can be a good or bad thing, depending on if it's a beneficial or negative microorganism that we're trying to control. Um, it's used as an ingredient, and not just an ingredient in the food, but it can be a functional ingredient. This picture here is meat in a meat chopper. So this is called a bowl chopper, and it's a just different way of reducing your particle size versus a grinder that using knives to chop it. So there'll be knives that spin around on this part that you can't see. And so it makes it a cleaner cut and protects the proteins better. But when they add water, they don't add it in the form of liquid water, they add it in the form of ice. And that keeps the proteins cool and prevents protein denaturation and the fat getting too warm and becoming more liquid during the sausage making process. Because if the fat becomes liquid, then you don't get a proper emulsion, which we'll talk about emulsions later. And so anyway, so the ice is actually twofold. It adds water to the mixture as an ingredient, but it also is functional and helps produce a higher quality sausage. Okay, and then last here, so this would be water more as an ingredient. So this is a picture of water vats that are going into soft drinks, right? So the water quality needs to be really good. You can't just use water from the tap. Number one, because there are other things in it, but also because there's variability. And so you want your Coke to taste the same, whether you are drinking it now or 2 months from now, or if you're drinking it here in Texas or in New York, it needs to taste the same. And so uh, this water is highly controlled so that it is going to be the same water being added anywhere, anytime that the sodas are made. So water is really unique amongst all of the chemicals. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why it sustains life for us. Um, It is the only substance that occurs in all three phases, solid, liquid, and gas, at natural Earth temperatures, right? So like the natural temperatures that weather on Earth produces. It is the only substance that can occur in all three phases on Earth without man's intervention, okay? It has the highest surface tension, and we'll talk about surface tension quite a bit in a little bit, of any liquid that is non-ionic and not metallic. Okay, so we're not mercury, for example. It is one of the few substances that has a solid phase that is less dense than the liquid phase. So what that means, ice floats, right? And that is actually a really important quality that helps sustain life on Earth. Fish are able to live in the water when in freezing temperatures because ice floats. Um, it has a high specific heat capacity, which we've talked about in previous chapters. And so before I get into the next part, we're going to talk just a little bit about covalent bonds, and then talk about how how water is affected here. So we've talked about covalent bonds, how electrons are shared between atoms in covalent bonds. And then there are two subtypes of covalent bonds. We have nonpolar and polar. Okay, so in a nonpolar covalent bond, the electrons are shared equally between the atoms. So this one, it's two hydrogen atoms here, and the electrons are shared fully equally, um, and the charges are balanced. Okay. In a polar covalent bond, there is an unequal sharing of electrons. And the reason that this happens is because there is something called electronegativity that atoms have. And when one atom is more electronegative than another, and they're not pulling equally, then that atom is going to take more of its fair share of the electron charge. All right. So the electron is still being shared. It's still going back and forth between the orbitals of the two atoms, but it's going to hang out more on one side than the other. And so that is going to result in an unequal charge. This unequal sharing of electrons is going to cause kind of a pulling effect, and the electrons will not be distributed equally in the molecule, and the atoms will, because of the charge, will kind of be pulled in a different direction than if it's nonpolar. So for example, in a nonpolar 3-atom molecule, so here we have carbon dioxide, the oxygens are pulling straight out from the carbon, okay? And there's equal sharing of electrons between the carbons and the oxygens. In water, there is unequal sharing, okay? And the oxygen is taking more than its fair share of the electrons. And so the hydrogens, they're just kind of pull away from each other, and it results in this bent structure that you see here. Okay. Here, so you have carbon and 4 chlorine, and if you were to measure all of these angles, all of these chlorines are exactly the same distance from each other in this nonpolar molecule. Okay. Whereas here, this one has 3 and not 4 atoms attached to the central atom. But again, you see this pulling away here, and this bent structure. It's not symmetrical. Nonpolar molecules are symmetrical, polar are not. Okay, so additionally, let's go back to thinking about another type of bond, our ionic bond. In that bond, the electrons were completely transferred, resulting in one atom getting a positive charge and the other atom getting a negative charge. These charges are whole integers. So you would say, like sodium chloride, sodium has a +1 charge, chloride has a -1 charge, are whole integers. Okay. But in this polar nonpolar case, you're still sharing that electron. So no one atom is getting a whole nother electron or losing a whole electron. Okay. And so what we call these charges that occur here is a partial charge. Okay. So this is what this little symbol here represents, that's next to the plus and the minus. It means this nitrogen has a partial negative charge. This hydrogen has a partial positive charge. Okay. And it just means that there's a charge on it, but it's less than 1, positive or negative. So again, here is the water molecule, and So the oxygen has a partial negative charge. The hydrogens each have a partial positive charge. And there is an angle here that is less than 180 because the way that these charges are, they're kind of like they're bending the molecule. Okay, so now that we've learned about the charges, now we can learn about hydrogen bonds. And this definition is another one that I've changed up from the book review, and that's why I've highlighted it or changed the color of the font to red in this slide, just to really point out, I want you to know this definition different from what it is in the book, okay? So my definition is quite similar, but the book is very water specific, and hydrogen bonds are not water specific. And so I've adjusted this definition to make sure you understand that a hydrogen bond can occur on any covalent polar molecule that has hydrogen. And it is simply the attraction of a positive hydrogen end of one molecule to the negative ends of another molecule. Okay. And this is a bond, but it is the weakest of the bonds that we've talked about so far. It is an intermolecular bond, which means between molecules. So every bond that we've talked about before is an intramolecular bond. It's the bonds that make up a molecule, okay? The ionic and covalent. Ionic is the strongest, and then covalent. And now we have hydrogen bonds, and it is intermolecular bond. So it is a bond between two different molecules. And these bonds are very easily broken, but they are responsible for something called surface tension. And so just visually, what you see happening here is the hydrogen are going to orient themselves towards the oxygen and produce this weak bond. And it's the partial positive charge on the hydrogen is attracted to the partial negative charge on the oxygen. And actually for each one of these, the oxygen, I don't have it shown in this little figure that I made, but the oxygen could have two hydrogen that are potentially attracted to it, because you think about it, this partial negative charge is going to be double that of what each of the partial positive charges are on the hydrogen, because there's two hydrogens that it's sharing electrons with. Okay, so hydrogen bonds lead to surface tension, and surface tension can be defined as the force between molecules at the outside edge of a substance. And so surface tension is responsible for everything that we see here. If you've ever done the experiment where you set a paper clip on top of the water and it actually sits on top of the water, it's not really floating, it's not, because it's denser than the water. If you push down that paper clip, it's going to sink immediately down to the bottom, but the surface tension at the top of the water holds it up, as it does with the water bug and some of these other things that we'll talk about. Okay. So this surface tension derives from the fact that water is cohesive. Okay, so cohesive forces are responsible for surface tension. And it's a phenomenon that results in the tendency of a liquid surface to resist rupture when under tension or stress. Okay, it resists falling apart. Cohesion means that they stick together. The water molecules stick together. Okay. And what happens here is that the water molecules at the surface, at the water-air interface here, will form hydrogen bonds with their neighbors. Okay, just like water molecules that are deeper within the liquid. But because they are exposed to air on one side, they'll have fewer neighboring partners to bond with. And because there's fewer of them, they'll form stronger bonds with those neighbors. Okay. And so this creates surface tension, is that the bonds up here at the air-liquid interface are stronger than the bonds that are down here in the more liquid, I mean, that's all liquid, but deeper into the liquid. Okay. Um, so this surface tension, it causes spherical droplets, right? Like in this picture, right? The spherical droplets, this right here, is caused by surface tension. Um, uh, and it also obviously allows it to support small objects, right? Like so like the paper clip, or if you stick a small scrap of paper on water, or you can do it with a needle, and of course like water bugs and stuff. And so these hydrogen bonds, it's occurring in all throughout the water, right? All these arrows here are representing hydrogen bonds and the water bonding with itself. Easily broken. We can run our hand through it and break those bonds quite easily, but just a little bit harder to break at the surface. Okay, and hence where light objects can just float, not float, float's not the right word, but can just like stand on the surface, because and not break the surface because of the stronger hydrogen bonds at the top. Okay. The other property that these hydrogen bonds give water is that water is adhesive. Okay, so cohesion is the tendency of water molecules to stick to each other. All right, that was the previous slide. Adhesion is the fact that water likes to stick to other things. Okay, and so this isn't hydrogen bonds within the water that is causing adhesion. It's actually the polar nature of the water causes it to stick to other things also besides water. Okay. It means that it's going to be attracted to anything that has a partial charge to it. Okay. So glass is more polar than water. Hence, the hydrogen in the water is going to form hydrogen bonds with the glass. And so that is why you get a meniscus in glass. Okay. That's also why if you stick a capillary tube into some water, it will actually move up the capillary tube. And that's actually a combination of the adhesion and cohesion, right? It is kind of climbing up that glass because it is attracted to the walls, the glass walls. But then the water also is sticking together. It's cohesive. And so it's more than just a little bit climbing up the walls. You get a full little column coming up the capillary tube if you do that. Now, we've talked about menisci before, but we haven't really seen it that much in our labs, and that's because we use plastic graduated cylinders. And plastic, so here's the glass ones. You can see the meniscus in each of these, right? But plastic, you don't really see it. And that is because plastic, not all plastics, but the plastics that we use in graduated cylinders is nonpolar. There's no charge. And so there is no charge for the hydrogen or oxygen to be attracted to on the surface of the plastic. And so we actually don't see a meniscus when we're using plastic graduated cylinders. Okay. Other applications of that would be um, uh, if you if you ever use FogX on your windows. Well, what that is that spray is nonpolar, and so you're adding this nonpolar spray to your window, and it prevents adhesion of water, and so you don't get fog. Or Rain-X, right? And where the rain just immediately flies right off of your window if it's raining. and it's that you have, it's a non-polar substance that you've added to the windows to keep that rain off. Um, Now plants. So this adhesive property is how plants are able to uptake water, right? Water is absorbed by the roots, and it works just like this capillary tube. It is the polar nature of the inside of the plant draws up the water, and the cohesive nature of water just keeps the column of water moving up there, and it is distributed all the way through the plant, where then finally lost through transpiration from the leaves. And then finally also, like, this is why like on this blade of grass, the water is below it, under it, right? But gravity isn't pulling it down, and that's because it is the non-polar, or sorry, the polar. I might have been saying some of the wrong words. So if the plants are polar, the plastic is nonpolar, glass is polar. Um, the so the grass has a polar surface, and the water is attracted to it and forms hydrogen bonds with the surface of the grass, and so that bond is stronger than the gravity that is trying to pull that water droplet down, right? Same thing when you see water droplets on a spider web. Okay, so this here is just a visual for your benefit. So just to help with a study guide, okay? And so cohesion is molecules holding on to each other. Adhesion is molecules that are bonding, doing hydrogen bonds. It's the oxygen holding it, but yeah. Polar bonds with whatever they're attached to. Some other substance. Okay. Okay. So some other effects of hydrogen bonds. Oops. Okay, so hydrogen bonds have a higher boiling point. I'm gonna stop this for a second. Can I stop it? Let me stop it. Hold on. Okay. Okay, so sorry, not hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds make water have a higher boiling point. It requires more energy to break free from the liquid form. So, and so what I mean by higher boiling point is higher boiling point than other liquids. Okay, other things that are liquid at room temperature, right? So I'm gonna show. I'll do the. Sorry, trying to get this next thing up here. We'll restart that. Okay. Hydrogen bonds also cause water to have a higher melting point than other substances that are liquid at Earth temperatures. Okay. And that is because it requires more energy to break free from the solid form. And so, because of that, water will freeze faster than it thaws. Okay. So it's easy to form rigid hydrogen bonds. It is harder to break them. Okay. So now let me rewind this and talk through it. Okay. So this is water turning to ice. Down here is the liquid state at the bottom. Okay, the hydrogen bonds are constantly forming and breaking. That's why you see all this activity. Okay, and in the gaseous state, which is not shown here, they're broken and they don't reform. Okay, in the solid state, they're formed and they stay in place for the most part. You see them wiggling around a little bit, but they're pretty much, staying in place. And so from this video, you can see how many more water molecules fit in the space when it's liquid versus the solid state, right? And so this highly ordered structure of the solid state, because it is forming much more rigid hydrogen bonds here. I mean, that's pretty clear, right? From just watching this. Um, this highly ordered structure is definitely less densely packed than when it was in the liquid state, right? This one more time, all right? Like there's a lot more molecules here versus at the top where the ice is forming, okay? And so this is why ice is less dense than liquid water. Okay, so now let's talk about bonds with water in solutions. Okay, we talked about water bonding with itself. We've talked about water um, bonding with the container it's in, or what it is on top of or underneath the adhesion, and those polar bonds. Now let's talk about solutions. Okay. So we've kind of discussed this before, not a lot, but ionic compounds, they dissolve and dissociate into ions in water, right? So you add sodium chloride to water, and it dissolves and dissociates into sodium ion and chloride ion in the water, right? But what about covalent compounds? If the covalent compound is polar, like water is polar, then it's going to form hydrogen bonds with water. Um, the same reason that water forms hydrogen bonds with itself, if it comes into contact with another polar molecule, it will form hydrogen bonds with it as well. Now, the strength may vary, um, just depending on the molecule and what those partial charges are on the molecule. Okay, so for example, sugar. Sugar is polar, and it will dissolve into individual molecules when it's put in water, and then those individual molecules will form hydrogen bonds with the water. Okay, this particular picture here, it's showing ethanol, but the same idea would apply if this was sugar. So let's pretend it's sugar, right? And if you remember our experiment where we were looking at density, and one of our substances was a simple syrup, high sugar solution. And if you remember, it was right next to the dyed water solution. And the line between them was a lot more fuzzy than some of the other liquids that were in the solution. And that's because basically this was happening there, right? Um, so initially, there is a density difference between the two solutions, and so one was on top of the other. But over time, because they're both polar, the sugar and the water, that sugar can easily mix in with the water. And so over time, if we had let that sit for several hours, it would have just fully mixed on its own. Just the way that liquid just naturally, the molecules are naturally moving all the time. Okay. And hydrogen bonds between the sugar and the water molecules would have formed, and you would have had just this fully mixed solution of the sugar water along with the original water. Now, if the covalent compound that we are mixing with the water is nonpolar, like oil, for example, it won't dissolve. And that's because it can't form hydrogen bonds. There is no charge for the partial charged areas of the water to bond with. Okay, and so that is why with oil, um, it will just completely separate based on the density, and they won't ever fully mix. Now let's talk about atmospheric pressure. Okay, so this is the idea that all atoms have weight, even those in air. Notice I'm not talking about mass, I'm talking about weight, being pulled down by gravity. Okay, and so the force of the weight of the molecules, atoms in the atmosphere pressing down on us is called atmospheric pressure. And there's various ways we can measure it. We can measure it in pascals, pounds per square inch, millibars, millimeters of mercury. For now, we're just going to focus on measuring it in atmosphere. And so 1 atmosphere is the air pressure, the atmospheric pressure at sea level at 15 degrees Celsius, which is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. And so the higher we are above sea level, there's less atmosphere above us pressing down. And so the atmospheric pressure is lower. So let's think about what is physically happening when a liquid changes to a gas. The molecules are moving around so quickly that they are colliding and then moving through the air. And when they're individual molecules, they're going to be less affected by gravitational forces, as well as hydrogen bonds. And we now know atmospheric pressure. Okay. So the collisions that molecules just naturally have, even in the liquid state, and the tendency, like even if we have liquid that is below boiling, you will sometimes have molecules that they collide, and they collide in such a way that one of them comes off out of the solution and it vaporizes. Okay. And so that those collisions and tendency to vaporize, it increases with increasing temperature. And so this vaporizing below the boiling point, that's called evaporation, right? And we've all seen that before. Okay. Um, so we call this tendency to vaporize vapor pressure. Okay. And the vapor pressure is going to increase the higher the temperature is, right? So the closer the temperature of our liquid gets to boiling, the more often we're going to have these collisions that cause molecules to fly out and vaporize, right? And it's when that tendency to collide so hard that water vaporizes is equal to or greater than the atmospheric pressure that is pushing it down, saying, no, stay down there. Okay. That is when we get full on boiling. Okay. So when the vapor pressure has risen so much due to temperature rise that it is equal to the atmospheric pressure, that is when we get boiling. Okay. So if we have less atmospheric pressure pushing down, then the temperature does not have to rise so far to get that vapor pressure high enough to get to boiling, right? Because there's less pressure coming down, so now there's not as much pressure is required to come up. Okay. And so then therefore, if the atmospheric pressure is lower, water will boil more easily at a lower temperature. Okay, so less pressure when we are up here and there's less atmospheric pressure pressing down on us means that our boiling point decreases. Okay, so at sea level, our boiling point is 100 degrees Celsius. If we get up to about 6,000 feet above sea level, we're down to 93. 10,000 feet would be 90. If we are trying to boil water at the height of an airplane, we're all the way down to 79 degrees Celsius, and water will boil. Now, what does that mean for cooking? Right? The temperature is still the temperature, right? So it doesn't matter if it's boiling, if it is still 10 degrees less than what my boiling temperature was for the recipe that was written for that food. I'm not cooking it as hot, and it's not going to be as well done, right? There's also some other factors that affect cooking beyond just that your temperature isn't going to be as hot with boiling. Um, so overall, as you'd expect, if the boiling point is lower, food takes longer to cook because we know that the food doesn't get above the boiling point, right? It vaporizes, the water vaporizes, and what's in the food still stays at the boiling point. Okay. So you have some options. You can cook the food for longer, or you can increase the oven temperature and reduce the baking time. Um, so, um, so yeah. So those are two options for baking. Okay. Um, you may need to reduce the sugar content when you do that. Um, because increasing the oven temperature is going to cause more of like a charring effect if you have higher sugar. Um, because the sugar can get above boiling, right? Okay, so less pressure also means that cakes are going to rise higher, right? They don't have the pressure pushing down on them. And so when they are producing those gases from the leavening agents, they're going to be able to rise higher. Now, they're not going to stay high necessarily, though, because they still don't have they only have the structure for a certain height, and it's being expanded and kind of like stretched thin. And so what often happens is that they'll rise really high, but you take them out of the oven and they just collapse because that structure has been stretched too thin and it can't support um, all this air that has built up inside it. Okay. Also, if they don't collapse, then there's a lot more air in the cake or bread or whatever, and so there's going to be a greater tendency for it to dry out from the inside. Okay. So some solutions to that: use more flour, so you do build up more structure, more bonds from that, so that it can support itself better. Um, Also, to have less rise, you can use less yeast if it's a yeast-based bread, or um, or bake sooner. I'm trying to think about what I meant to have in there. Um, oh, with a bread. Don't let your bread before you stuck it in the oven like rise too much. Like stick it in the oven sooner, and um, and there'll be less carbon dioxide built up, and you'll have less rise in the bread. Okay. If you're doing egg whites, you might want to beat them less than normal because there's going to be extra expansion just caused by the high altitude cooking. And finally, reduce the amount of leavening agents that you use so there isn't quite as much rise um, from those. Okay. The other thing about high altitude cooking, or one other thing, is that liquids do evaporate faster. Um, and for the same reason that they boil more easily, uh, the vapor pressure is going to be uh, closer to what the atmospheric pressure is, and so it's more likely for um, evaporation to occur. Okay, so foods do dry out more quickly, and so you might want to use more water in some of your foods if you're doing high altitude cooking. Okay, so we've talked about low pressure, right? And high altitude, high atmospheric, or sorry, high altitude cooking, we have lower atmospheric pressure. So what then does high pressure do? Okay, remember that the boiling point with water is the maximum temperature unless we've captured that steam. Okay, steam can be higher than 100 degrees Celsius, Boiling water cannot. So let's enter the pressure cooker. Okay. So this is a way for us to cook using water at a higher temperature by altering the boiling point. All right. And also capturing the steam. Okay. So since at lower pressures, water boils at a lower temperature, what we've talked about with atmospheric pressure, well, higher pressures, it's going to boil at a higher temperature. Okay. So the pressure in an instant pot, for example, can increase to about 2 atmospheres, which increases the boiling temperature to about 121 degrees Celsius. So by about 21 Celsius degrees, we can increase the boiling temperature. And that dramatically decreases cooking time. So here you have some examples here. Black beans, just on a stovetop would take 60 minutes to cook, and using a pressure cooker, only 15 minutes, because the temperature is able to get so much higher that we can cook faster, right? Brown rice, 50 minutes versus 20 minutes. Whole chicken, 60 minutes versus 15 minutes. Like a roast, same thing. So really, really cool stuff for cooking foods more quickly, harnessing the power of pressure. Okay, so this is where we're skipping ahead to towards the end of the chapter and talking about water content in foods as well as water activity. Okay, so this is just a list, kind of a reference of how much water is in various foods. So notice that the foods that have not been processed, so fruits, vegetables, animal foods, okay, they have high water amounts. All right, cucumbers 90 are made of 96% water, right? Apples 86%, milk 88%, eggs 78, raw meat 75. This salmon, it might be cooked salmon. It might be higher if it's raw. So the only one here that hasn't been processed be like honey at 20% is lower. All right, but even things that you think of being as very dry, like flour, has 11% water in it. All right, popcorn has 4%, almonds 5%. I guess that would be one that's not really processed, but so the water content in foods can be divided into two main parts. Okay, first we have bound water. Now, note this is red. I've changed the definition. Use this definition and not the one in your book. Okay, so bound water is water that cannot be easily separated in food. And essentially that's because it has formed hydrogen bonds with the molecules of food, especially proteins and starches. Okay, because it is bound, there's hydrogen bonds with something else, it cannot react with other substances. Okay, it also freezes only at very low temperatures. In some cases, it can be negative 40 degrees Celsius, and that water will not be in the frozen state. Okay, so because of the bonds that it's having, it changes its physical characteristics. It also will vaporize at higher temperatures. So it'll boil at higher temperatures. Now, this bound water, it may be very tightly bound or it may be loosely bound. It just depends on what it is binding with. Also, even the physical structure of what it's binding with. Sometimes it may actually be like entrapped in the folds of a protein, because a protein is not just one long structure. There's lots of nooks and crannies and things, and the water can actually be entrapped in them. Um, but it may also be loosely bound. It may be a hydrogen bond that um, it's not super strongly attracted to whatever it's binding to, and can quite easily come unbound. Okay, this brings us to another definition in the book called a hydrate. So the way this describes it is almost like there's three kinds of water: bound, free, and hydrates. And I'm going to tell you no on that. Hydrate falls under bound, because when you read the definition of hydrate, it says it's bound, right? So a hydrate is any chemical compound that is loosely bound with water. Okay, so the hydrate is not the water, it is the chemical that it is bound to. Okay, and um, and it is loosely bound. We can heat this hydrate up, and the water will be driven off of that compound and evaporate. Okay, when the hydrate loses all of the water that was bound to it via hydrogen bonds, loosely bound, then it is called anhydrous, which means without water, right? Free of water. Okay, so then the second way that water is contained in food is as free water. And that is defined as water that is easily separated from food tissues. So I've simplified that bound water definition, right? By just changing it up from what the free water definition is. Okay, so free water is water that is easily separated from food tissues, and bound water is water that cannot be easily separated. Okay, so easy to remember the new definition. So free water, it can be pressed or squeezed out. If you cut something open, it might just come out just like that. It's easily boiled, frozen, or evaporated. So if you are boiling that substance, it will come out. If you're freezing it, that water will be frozen. If you are trying to dry it, to just remove the water, then it will be the water that evaporates. That said, there's always going to be some water that stays behind that cannot be evaporated. That's the bound water. Okay. So now let's talk about food preservation as it described as water relates to it. Okay, so in the book there is a descriptive comparing carrots and milk. Don't use that. It's misleading. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So carrots and milk have about the same amount of water, 88% water, but milk is more likely to spoil. And they're like, well, this milk spoils in your lunchbox, but the carrot doesn't. And that's because the carrot water is all bound, and that's not true. Because if you have a juicer and you put a carrot in a juicer, you know you can squeeze out a lot of juice out of the carrot, quite a bit, right? And the reason the carrot seems drier is really just because that juice was entrapped in the cell walls. Well, that's not bound water, right? If you physically disrupt those cell walls, it comes right out. You can squeeze it out. And that means that it was free water. The reason that carrot can stand being in your lunchbox and the milk can't is because those cell walls do kind of keep that water contained, right? And also the exterior of the carrot is relatively dry, which prevents microbes from growing on the exterior, right? So not the best example. So let's do a more fair comparison, okay? So I have salami and cooked beef, right? This is like a cooked roast beef. And that you just regular beef, roast beef cooked in the oven. Okay, so those, you can bring a salami in your lunchbox and it can even get to room temperature for a little bit and be perfectly safe, right? You do that with this piece of roast and you're going to have problems, right? Within a couple of hours, there's going to be food safety concerns. But yet these both have about the same amount of water. They both have about 60% water. We've cooked off a lot of the water out of this roast, and the salami is also down to 60% water. So why are they so different? Okay. And the answer is the water activity. Okay. The water activity, which is denoted with an A, and it can be capital or lowercase with a W subscript. Water activity is the measure of the partial pressure. The book says over a food. I think that's a typo. So partial water pressure of a food. Okay, so what does that mean, right? So here's the more complicated definition and the most correct definition, but it's okay to, this one is still correct, so I'm not changing it on you. But this is like the most official definition. The ratio of the vapor pressure of a food to the vapor pressure of pure water at the same temperature. So remember, vapor pressure is that tendency of the water to change into the gaseous state. Okay, and this happens without the material being at boiling temperatures. All right, this evaporation. Well, in order for water to do that, it has to be unbound. It has to be free water. Okay, and so what is this vapor pressure, the free water, kind of a measure of the free water of a food, compared to the vapor pressure of pure water? Well, it's all free, right? And so essentially what water activity is measuring is just the free water as a proportion of, I guess, as a ratio compared to if it was all free water. Okay, so the free water in the food compared to what if it were all free water? Okay, and the most like applied definition of this is the water that is available to support the activity of enzymes and growth of microorganisms. Okay, so to support the growth of microorganisms, the water has to be free water, right? That microorganisms have to be able to easily access it. And the same for enzymes. So, looking at different microorganisms, I just wanted to share what the water activity levels are that are required for different microorganism growth. So bacteria require a water activity of 0.91 or higher, most bacteria. Okay, so this is blue line, right? And the higher the water activity, the closer you get to 1 where all the water is freely available, then the greater the growth is. However, some pathogenic bacteria, especially Staphylococcus aureus, only need a water activity of about 0.86 or higher. Okay, and so in the meat industry, especially, well, in lots of industries, you specifically target that because if you can get the water activity below that for things that you are making drier with less water activity, that's protected you from pathogenic bacteria. Okay, yeasts require a water activity of about 0.8 or higher. You can see this purple line here. And then molds require water activity, for the most part, of 0.7 or higher. Now, there's always some exceptions to these general statements with these microorganisms, but if your water activity is less than 0.6, there is no microbial growth that will occur. So let's go back to our salami and cooked beef example. Okay, they're both 60% water, but the water activity of the salami is 0.82. So we do not have bacterial growth at that water activity, pathogenic or otherwise. Okay. For the cooked beef, that water activity is 0.98. really close to 1. And so lots of things can happily grow on that cooked beef. Now, how do we reduce that water activity if they are the same percent water? We add salts, which perform a couple different functions. The salts themselves reduce the available water, but also they affect the proteins, and then the proteins bind more water. Also, the addition of acids also can reduce the water activity. And both of those happen with salami. Okay. We've also dried the salami, but obviously there's still the same amount of water. So I wouldn't say that we haven't lost more moisture than in the cooked beef, but we've just done other things to bind that water up so that it's not available for microbial activity. And so that's why we can have salami at room temperature. Some salami, not all of it. Okay. So last slide here is just some examples of different products and their water activity. This says biscuits. I think that this is probably UK. And so it's probably crackers for US lingo. What a 0.2, right? Things don't grow on crackers unless they've been moistened. Honey has a water activity of 0.5 to 0.65, so you really don't get growth in honey. Fresh meat, 0.98. All right, all the microorganisms love fresh meat. Dried fruits, right, have water activity of 0.6 to 0.65, so you can still sometimes get some fungal growth on those, some molds potentially. Some of the more rare ones, most of them you've reduced the chances of getting them. But fresh vegetables or fresh fruits, water activity of 0.97 to 0.99. And so hence spoilage, and why we dry things to reduce spoilage. Dried meat, 0.8 to 0.92. So some of this dried meat still needs to be refrigerated because microorganisms can still grow on it, but you still extend how long it can last. You extend the shelf life by drying it. And so that is our chemistry portion of water. And next week we'll cover kind of some of the more applied concepts with water.